Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. This week I talked to Fred Lutzi, the president of the Land Institute, a science-based research organization in Kansas in the United States that works with a unique alternative to current destructive agricultural practices using perennial crops. Fred grew up on an Illinois farm and has dedicated his career to working with sustainable agriculture and with rural communities. And he's also got deep roots with the Institute itself, having been part of the Fellows program back in 2002. Now, in this episode, Fred and I talk about the Land Institute's vision and approach to sustainable agriculture, which is quite unique and quite different to some of the other approaches that I've come across. And so we'll start off by discussing some of the overarching problems that we're currently facing in agriculture, and then talk in depth about the structural changes that Fred and the Land Institute are advocating for. So a lot of the initiatives that I've come across and a lot of the initiatives that are hitting media headlines focus very much on tweaking the current industrial system of agriculture that we have. So by that I mean it's about improving the current system, tweaking it, improving efficiencies, whereas the Land Institute is working to displace the system that we have. To be clear, we're not just talking here about displacing the current industrial agricultural system that we have, that we've developed over the last half century. We're talking about tackling a system of annual crop monocultures that as humans have come to rely on over the past 10,000 years. And that's because the Land Institute is developing a system of perennial crops that mimics the functioning of a natural ecosystem. So it's all about developing a system, a polyculture rather than a monoculture that can work with rather than against nature in order to produce the food that we need. And so instead of spending all this energy in modern agriculture on fighting these ecological processes at work, nature at work in the fields, in order to grow our crops, what the Land Institute proposes is that we harness these energies instead. And so without further delay, I'm very excited to bring to you Fred Lutzi, the president of the Land Institute. Fred, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What I'd like to do in this short time that we have together, Fred, is talk about the Land Institute's vision for sustainable agriculture and answer what is, essentially one of the biggest questions we have today in the world of food, which is, how are we going to grow enough food for 9 billion people by 2050 is what everyone's saying, without, essentially destroying the planet first. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I think it'd be great if we could paint a picture for the listeners out there of what farming could look like and what it hopefully will look like under what the Land Institute terms the natural systems agriculture. So maybe we should start, instead of jumping right into what the Land Institute does in terms of perennial grains and ecologically intensified polycultures, and we can talk all about what those things mean, maybe we should start by asking, why do we need a change in the first place in the agricultural system that we have? So, what for you, I guess, is the biggest issue or the biggest issues that we're facing with the way that we grow our food today?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is best defined by how intractable over time many of the negative environmental impacts of agriculture have been. In other words, how they have defied lots of attempts using lots of different methods at resolving. So issues like soil erosion, like water quality, especially related to runoff of agricultural fertilizers, biodiversity issues, to some extent food safety issues. These have been things that we've been whacking our heads against here since, in some respects, since the dawn of agriculture many thousands of years ago. And in other senses, most vividly, we've been whacking our heads against some problems since the start of agricultural science and industrialized agriculture about 100 years ago. The Land Institute kind of received its early direction as an organization in part because of a fairly consequential U.S. General Accounting Office report that came out in the late 70s that our founder, Wes Jackson, read on soil erosion that was documenting the many decades-long history and the many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in 1970s dollars the U.S. Had spent fighting soil erosion since the Dust Bowl era. But yet, on average, the problem was practically as bad in the late 70s as it was in 1930. And so it's moments like that, when we have to reconcile with the fact that we have been trying a family of related approaches to improve the environmental performance of agriculture. Right. Without a whole lot of success for a long time. We have to reconcile with the fact that it may be time to consider something new. If that gets at your question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really interesting that you touch upon this idea that we've been, I think especially now more than ever, is a lot of people are pumping a lot of money into, I guess, improving the efficiency or tweaking the system that we currently have, and rather than maybe looking for alternative solutions that see, I guess, modern agriculture as the problem rather than how inefficient we are. It's interesting to see a lot of people are still trying to, they're convinced it's a matter of ironing out the wrinkles, so to speak. It's just a matter of getting rid of the inefficiencies. And then if we just hold on a little longer, we can meet the needs of tomorrow with the current system that we have.
And getting rid of inefficiencies is good. Maximizing the environmental performance of the agriculture we have is good. I come from a family farming, conventional grain and livestock background myself in Illinois, and I'm proud, very proud, frankly, of the work that my family has done over multiple generations to improve, in a lot of respects, the farming that we've done, that my parents and my brother continue to do in Western Illinois. And I feel like I can at the same time be proud of that, but also take the perspective that long term, we need to be looking for larger leaps than even the most conscientious stewardship have been able to provide with the ag that we're dealing with right now.
Sure. So, and these larger leaps that you speak of, I mean, is this where, I guess, the idea of natural systems agriculture that the Land Institute talks about, is that where that comes in? Could you maybe explain, just in a broad way, what that means and how that's different from the current system?
Sure, and I'll go back to the 1970s. Land Institute was founded by Dr. Wes Jackson in 1976 with a fairly broad brief at sustainability issues, kind of society-wide throughout human endeavor. And I mentioned this U.S. federal government report on soil erosion that provided some focus on agriculture as a key problem area. And then another experience that Wes Jackson had within a couple of years of that was spending some time with researchers on the Kanza Prairie in central Kansas. This is a large tract of native grassland in Kansas that's preserved and managed for research purposes. And so Wes was able to reflect at some length on the ecological performance of native prairie in terms of water quality, in terms of soil, of an extremely low rate of soil erosion, zero rate of soil erosion in many cases, in terms of being able to persist without much human intervention to manage weeds and pests, things like that, and to link that environmental performance with the ecological structure of the plant community that made up the prairie, and with the physical structure of the plants that made up that plant community. So in other words, these prairie plants are perennials, is one very key characteristic of them. They regrow from year to year without needing to be reseeded each time. And if you look around the world, the vast majority of cases, the native vegetation in any particular locale is perennial. Annual plants occupy a very small niche in nature, mostly where some big disturbance has taken place. A volcano has erupted, or something like that. Right. Otherwise, it's perennial. The other key characteristic is that unlike our crop fields and a lot of our highly managed ecosystems, which consist of monocultures of a single species, native vegetation is almost almost always takes the form of more or less diverse plant communities made up of a mixture or a polyculture of species. And so Wes and others working and writing at the time started connecting those dots that our crop production, our grain crop production agriculture, all the way back to the inception of grain crops 10,000 years ago, was based on annual plants that are so rare, in nature, and that you can draw a line from there to the specific negative environmental impacts that we see from crop production, so that it's not necessarily entirely an issue of an insufficient commitment to stewardship as a society, although we definitely. That is an issue that we have, but it goes beyond that to just a physical lack of suitability of the tools that we're using in agriculture in the form of the crops that we historically and currently have available for farmers to grow.
Sure. So this idea of a monoculture that we currently have in agriculture, and a system, especially with grains, it's very much reliant dependent on annuals. I mean, what's the main problem there? Is it the fact that it's very disruptive? Is it the fact that you rely too heavily on fertilizers, on pesticides to kill weeds? I mean, why is it much more logical to someone that doesn't necessarily know about these issues? Why is it more logical to turn to perennial crops?
So when we are out explaining our work and the rationale behind it to people live, we will often bring a particular poster that we have. Sure. That's a life-size photograph of the root system of a kernza plant. That's one of the perennial grain crops we're developing that shows at 1-to-1 scale the plant above ground and the plant below ground. And we take this poster that's rolled up on a canvas material, and we start unrolling it, and we keep unrolling it, and we keep unrolling it. And this poster is ultimately about 20 feet long, and almost 15 feet of that is showing the root system of this 2-year-old kernza plant. That's obviously very long. It's very dense. It's a dense network of fibrous roots. You can't see any of the black backdrop really between these roots. Next to the kernza plant and its root system, there's a wheat plant, an annual wheat plant of the kind that's grown today, and its root system. And this is a healthy wheat plant that any farmer or agronomist would be happy with in the context of wheat farming. But its root system is absolutely puny in comparison to the kernza roots. It's not very long, not very extensive, not very thick, and that that image sums up a lot of the answer to your question. That we can see that perennials have an opportunity because they live from year to year, and because they are ready to get started growing right away, early in the season, and grow until late in the season. They have the ability to collect a lot of sunlight, do a lot of photosynthesis, and invest a lot of that into a root system. And so, so perennial plants are constantly pumping carbon underground, which goes directly to soil carbon from a greenhouse gas balance standpoint, but it also goes to creating a favorable microenvironment for soil microbes, for beneficial soil microbes that are key to soil health and plant health and nutrient uptake for plants. This long root system is also good for reaching way into the soil profile to extract water, that may be unavailable to annual crops with shorter root systems, and it's good for preventing soil erosion. And so that's kind of the foundation here. Above ground, the fact that a perennial plant gets started earlier in the growing season, speaking in temperate climate terms here, places that have a warm season and a cold season, it gets started earlier, has some advantages in terms of, potential productivity from a yield standpoint. And then, you mentioned disturbance, and that was right on, that there's much less need for soil disturbance or disturbing just physical coverage of the ground. And so there's reduced opportunities for soil erosion from raindrops impacting bare soil. There's reduced opportunity for weeds to have any access to sunlight under these dense, perennial plant leaves and stems, and it's just, the whole system from a biological standpoint, from an ecological standpoint, is revved up a lot more for more of the year than we see with annual crops, which in temperate climates, really are not present on the landscape for very much of the year.
And so, now my question, I guess, is, because this sounds like you were saying, biologically speaking, ecologically speaking, it makes a lot of sense, but why aren't we seeing more of this already? Is it, economically speaking, is it an issue of short-term profit? Do annuals currently offer farmers or big agribusiness better short-term profits? Why are we not seeing the commercialization of perennials yet, of perennial crops, grain especially?
Yeah, to put it in a slightly flip way, it's because perennial grain crops don't exist, or at least historically have not existed. Save for the work that we're doing, and there have been several episodes in the 20th and 21st century where there have been bits of work developing perennial grain crops. We do see, of course, a lot of perennial crop production in the form of forage crops or hay or pasture crops that ruminant livestock can graze on, or that can be baled and fed to ruminant livestock. And we get pretty much potentially all of the environmental benefits I described for a perennial grain crop system are already available in perennial forages, but the issue is that both in terms of dietary breadth and then simply the logistics of a lot of people being fed, we need a lot of grass-fed beef, for example. But we need more than that also. We need to break up the current dilemma that farmers and land managers have, where they have a hard choice between the conservation benefits of having something in perennial grass, as a forage crop, versus producing the starches and the vegetable oils that we need for the bulk of our calories, but sacrificing ecological functionality by putting these annuals out. Now, the question then goes to, why have perennial grain crops not been developed? And that is in part because of what you mentioned, that there are not strong economic incentives for the agricultural research establishment, historically either private or public sectors, to go there. Because you can make a lot of money on all of the inputs that are required for annual crop production. we're seeing an increasing interest in the public and private sectors around perennial grain crops, but historically, I think incentives, have explained in large part why this hasn't happened.
All right, I guess that's where the Land Institute is very much pioneering. It's that from my understanding, you're breeding perennials in two ways. You're domesticating wild perennial plants, but you're also perennializing, if that's a word, existing annual crops, right? So could you tell us a little bit about how the Land Institute is, how their research and how you're developing this?
Sure. So the Kernza crop that I mentioned is an example of the domesticating wild plants strategy. Now, Kernza is a trade name, essentially, that we've come up with for intermediate wheatgrass that has been bred into a grain crop. Intermediate wheatgrass is a cool season grass, a perennial grass that's native originally to Central Asia and to the Middle East, but that's been naturalized in the Western U.S. and it's grown some as a forage crop here. But our researchers are using classical plant breeding techniques that can, in large part, be described as growing lots of plants, observing them carefully individually, lots of intermediate wheatgrass plants, taking notes on the best performing plants in terms of yield, in terms of seed size, in terms of non-shattering, which is jargon for keeping the seeds in the seed head rather than dropping them, pell-mell on the ground, and then saving the seed from the best performing plants to plant again in the next generation. There's a lot of fancy math that guides exactly how that process is done, and there's some controlled intermating of which individual plants are the parents of the next generation, but it's basically just picking the best performing plants. That approach for plants that have ready genetic potential to increase seed size and so forth is kind of a slow and steady reliable kind of approach. And with this Kernza intermediate wheatgrass, we've gotten to the point where we have yields that are worth running a combine through and mechanically harvesting, that are of enough interest to the food industry that there are some niche products even that Kernza is being commercially grown and purchased to go into.
I saw you have sorry to interrupt, a partnership with Patagonia Provisions for a beer, which is definitely exciting.
Yeah, that's right. A Long Root Ale is the name of the beer, brewed with 15% Kernza. Was introduced last fall, and it has been exciting. And then just a couple of weeks ago, General Mills publicly announced that their Cascadian Farms organic label would be over the next year or two would be starting to purchase Kernza and integrate that into some of their food products. And so the scale is very small at this point, and we really view these products as much as anything offering a glimpse as to what full commercialization could look like years hence. But it's exciting to again to kind of glimpse the future of what actual agricultural production and actually cooking with and eating perennial grain crops could look like.
That's definitely exciting.
Kernza is a cousin of wheat. It's not wheat, but it's a cousin of wheat. Like, for example, rye is a cousin of wheat, and so it can partially replace wheat in some functions. And then to allude to the taking annual crops and making them perennial, then we have a parallel effort here to create an actual perennial wheat. It won't be a cousin to wheat; it will be wheat. There we're starting with an annual crop wheat and hybridizing it with this same intermediate wheatgrass species I mentioned to get pretty much just the set of traits that confer perenniality from intermediate wheatgrass but to keep as much of the genetics from wheat that deal with yield and quality as we can. And so there, the genetics are a lot more complicated. The breeding techniques that we need to use are more complicated. And it's it's maybe a tortoise and a hare metaphor, where the direct domestication is the slow and steady wins the race tortoise approach, and this perennial wheat project is a lot more complicated to get results. But if we're successful, we'll all of a sudden be jumping into the market with a yield that's much closer to the yield of currently cultivated annual wheat, rather than gradually building up to that point. So we're excited about the potential for both. And then we've got examples, of both of these approaches in other crops we're working on: perennial grain sorghum, perennial silphium, that's a wild relative of sunflower. We recently hired a perennial legume breeder to be breeding a crop that could function, a perennial crop that could function as an oil seed like soybeans, or as a protein crop like dry beans. And then we're sponsoring research in China to develop perennial rice.
That's fantastic. Especially, it's exciting to see that it's not just commercializing, I guess, in the West, but that it's kind of got a broad reach across the whole world, and that it could potentially, especially with rice, I think that's very exciting. If that can be perennialized, feeds about half of the world's population. So
it is, and the sorghum project I mentioned also is we have several collaborations in sub-Saharan Africa going on with that, and sorghum is very important for subsistence food systems in that region, and could be pretty applicable to the situation that those farmers are in, maybe even before the stage that it's ready for prime time in North America and Western Europe. So,
and I guess as well, it's important. When you see a lot of these droughts taking place nowadays, especially in East Africa, it comes to mind, could perennials there play an important role too, in the fact that they might be more drought resistant, that they might be more resilient to climate change?
Yeah, exactly. And the beauty of it is that perennial vegetation, whether it's the perennial grain crops that we're working on, or whether it's perennial grazing systems, whatnot, they are an adaptive strategy, as you just mentioned, to climate change. But they're also a mitigative strategy, because they're increasing in some amount, which we have a hunch is pretty significant, the amount of carbon sequestration that's going on. Yeah. And so, so it's sort of the opportunity to pursue two strategies to respond to climate change at the same time.
That's fantastic. I saw as well that the Land Institute, and I think this is very important to touch upon, and it's not just, I guess, a focus on perennials and encouraging perennials, but it's putting that into as I mentioned in the introduction, the ecologically intensified polyculture, right? That mimics natural systems. So it's not just a matter of replacing annual monocultures with perennial monocultures, but there's really an emphasis in your work on mimicking a natural system that's complex and that's very much I guess rich in the sense that it's a polyculture. Could you talk a little bit about the work being done there and what kind of initiatives you're supporting and the vision you have?
Absolutely. So the concept here is, as I alluded to before, is that the concept of a mixture of species allows there to always be something going on biologically in a particular field setting, and so there's implications for outcompeting weeds. There's implications for fostering the right environment for soil microbes and therefore soil and plant health. And then there's major implications for being resilient to insect and disease pests. A monoculture of crops or of any plant species is sort of this endless buffet of just exactly the right food source for insects or diseases that are specialists on that particular plant. And when you start having a mixture of 2 plants or 3 plants or 4 plants, you all of a sudden you have to make those pest organisms work a lot harder to find. Most insects that are agricultural pests and most diseases are quite specialized, and so if they have to find their host plant, their food plant in a mixture, you've just right there often really taken the wind out of the sails of the potential of a pest organism to successfully attack a crop at a level that becomes truly problematic. So we're hoping that both from the standpoint of reducing the environmental and the human health burden of herbicides and pesticides that are applied, and from the standpoint of lowering input costs for farmers' bottom line, that we can use these mixtures to allow organisms to be doing the work, to be a program of biological or ecological intensification, rather than having to use intensive management from a standpoint of very sophisticated and very energy dense inputs that we're putting on, again, at an expense to farmers, literally, financially, and at an expense to society, environmentally. And, we also have high hopes that we can be sponsoring a lot of our own nitrogen fertility in our perennial polyculture cropping systems. Nitrogen fertilizer is by far the crop input in most agriculture now that has the largest environmental burden associated with it, and that's what a legume crop like alfalfa or clover or something like that can provide. Not only nitrogen fertility for itself, but if you are clever and deliberate in how you breed a legume crop and how you physically arrange it in space and in time relative to other crops, it can maybe be supplying some nitrogen fertilizer to the grass crops growing next to it that can't make their own. And so there again is an example of substituting a higher level of ecological functioning for a purchased synthetic input.
So is that something that you're looking into then with Kernza at the moment, having a legume as a sort of understory cover crop, I guess? I mean, is that how it would work? It would be partnering?
Absolutely. And so Kernza is further along in the R&D process, further along towards commercialization than the other crops that we're working with. And so it's, in one sense, it's hard to have a polyculture of perennial grain crops when you only have one perennial grain crop that is at a pre-commercialization stage. In another sense, a polyculture of perennials does not have to be multiple perennial grain crops. It can simply be multiple perennials. And so we have the opportunity already, as we are right now, to research simple 2-species mixtures of Kernza with a perennial forage crop. Alfalfa is the one that we're working with the most extensively, that could simply be a green manure crop supplying nitrogen, or it could be harvested for its livestock feed value. And then as we have as perennial grain or oilseed legume crops advance further in our research process, then we'll be able to work directly with polycultures of Kernza and those perennial grain legumes. And the same goes for all the crops that we're developing. As they get to the point where we have something that's approaching the final ecological performance that we're going to see from a real perennial grain crop in, our sunflower program, for example, or our sorghum program, then we can really dig in on how to grow that in polyculture with the other perennial crops that are available.
That's fantastic. That's definitely exciting, as we were saying, that to see that, there's not only promise of commercialization, but that you're having, big food companies like General Mills getting involved and kind of putting their money where their mouth is, I guess. Do you see any challenges? Do you have any concerns in the immediate future of perhaps things, for lack of a better phrase, things going wrong, especially with the commercialization aspect? Could it be said that we risk, if we push this too quickly, of skipping a few fundamental steps and essentially messing things up?
Right. So the thing that we try to be especially mindful of, given that we've been pleasantly surprised by how quickly Kernza, in particular, this intermediate wheatgrass perennial grain that's a cousin to wheat, how quickly that we've made progress on it, and how it's sort of pulled out into the lead relative to the other crops. And we're trying to sort of walk the line between letting farmers, letting chefs and master bakers, and letting large food companies kind of fulfill the excitement that they're feeling around, having an early stage perennial grain crop, between, sort of having that play out, but at the same time to make sure that this vision of a crop that's high yielding enough that it's not merely going to go on limited acreage on peripheral areas of the landscape, that it's ultimately, decades hence is going to be starting to replace annual wheat production in part, is our goal. And that goal for how prevalent we think that this has to be in our food and ag system long term, that isn't lost, and that the polyculture or the ecological diversity, ecological intensification context is also not lost.
Yeah.
And it, I think things are unfolding fairly well here, but we certainly are going to be doing a little bit of a two-step dance here, celebrating the point that Kernza is at, while reminding everybody of the fact that we're in the middle of the project. Our founder, Wes Jackson, has often said that he regards the Land Institute's work as a 50 to 100 year trajectory, and the Land Institute has celebrated its 40th birthday last year, and so from a standpoint of 100 years, we're not quite halfway in that respect, and that will be how long it takes to minimum to completely see this vision out. Hopefully big pieces of it are going to be coming into place well before 60 years from now, but it's going to be a gradual process. And the other thing that's important to remember too is that while we're delighted at the momentum that the work is having, not only have we been successful at broadening our fundraising, acquiring more resources than we had 20 years ago, 40 years ago. And we've been successful at attracting collaboration from public universities and government research agencies in the U.S. and abroad. This is still a fairly small scale effort when you contrast it to what goes into conventional annual crop agricultural research. There's a number that the USDA attempted to put to private sector investments in R&D for growing annual crops in a study a few years ago, and it was something like $9 billion a year.
Oh, wow.
And, so we have, at this point, we have about a $4 million budget, million with an M, ourselves, and there's, probably that much money, something like that much money, again, being spent by our collaborators. That's more than the Land Institute was founded on in 1976, which was probably a four-digit, amount of money. But it's still we need, we need this effort needs all the help it can get in terms of people who are environmentally concerned, people who are agriculturally concerned, continuing to ask hard questions about why $9 billion is going towards annual crops, and that's the private sector alone there, and why we can't have more resources allocated to this kind of work, that we hope that rather than chipping away in an extremely incremental way at pretty pernicious, long-standing problems, why can't we focus more resources on trying to bypass and transcend those problems with basically a complete reboot of how we conceptualize a crop plant and how we grow it.
Definitely, I think your point about collaboration specifically is very important. That it's not just the Land Institute, but that like I saw as well that you're the Global Inventory Project, that you're working with universities and research institutions, and also I think that it becomes public knowledge that there's initiatives out there that are working with these issues, and that we can tackle agricultural problems from a lot of different perspectives, and especially as well, like you said, that we don't ignore the the $9 billion being invested annually from private institutions alone in the current system. Would you like to just touch a little bit more maybe on I guess the public perception of the work that you're doing, and I guess the general awareness and what listeners can do to do their part in this fight?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's been very positive to see, especially over the last 15 years, maybe I'll say, there's been an explosion in public awareness and public interest in making our food system more sustainable environmentally, more desirable and appetizing, in terms of a perspective of an eater, of localizing food systems, adopting sustainable practices in how crops and livestock are produced. People are a lot more aware of terms like sustainable agriculture, terms like organic farming. What I would encourage people to do is to be aware of the need for a mix of more modest short-term strategies, but also not forgetting longer-term, higher impact strategies. So for example, so I'm a big advocate of organic farming. I actually started my career in a sustainable farm organization that provides information support to farmers on exactly that kind of topic. But at the same time, we need to aspire long term to larger changes than upgrading, the ecological integrity of how we grow annual crops. Right? We need to, which is what an organic label, essentially signifies. Right now, that we need to be, ultimately having this perennial polyculture, vision, and so, I would encourage, the public to not to go beyond buying a label that seems positive, at the supermarket, and then considering that the problem, has been resolved, right? They should buy those labels: organic, humanely produced livestock, anything that's a real statement of improved ecological functioning. But at the same time, they need to be conscious in terms of agricultural policy, in terms of what they're advocating for, in terms of their philanthropic activities or just what they're supporting and engaging in dialogue on, that we need to keep pushing, that the solutions that are available in the grocery store today are not ultimately going to be sufficient for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren to have a sustainable, prosperous future as farmers or as eaters. We need to sort of keep our edge on, I think, as a society and as a sustainable food and agriculture movement on what it really looks like to achieve sustainability.
I couldn't agree more. I think that perfectly sums it up. Fred, is there a website or maybe resources that you'd want to direct people to that can learn more about not only the Land Institute, but the topics that we touched upon?
Sure, yeah. Our website is landinstitute.org, and we have a picture of some of that deep root system photography I alluded to, several pictures of that. It explains our work, and then if people visit that site and click on the research partners section, there'll be a clickable map with little stars on every continent other than Antarctica that show where our collaborators are working and have more information about the projects they're engaging in. And people can kind of get a sense of the global effort on this and how potentially they can plug in. We also for people who have the interest and ability to travel to Kansas in the United States, we have an annual gathering, be September 22nd through 24th this year, called Prairie Festival. That is, the New York Times sent a reporter a couple of years ago and called Prairie Festival an intellectual hootenanny. We have about 1,000 people sit in a historic barn and listen to talks from a mixture of nationally and internationally recognized sustainable ag and food futures speakers. But then also updates from our own research staff on the Land Institute's work, and it's a pilgrimage that I would encourage anybody interested in sustainable ag to make at least once. So that's in the details on that, of course, are on the website also. So
perfect. I'll be adding all those links to the description so people can go there and. No, that's fantastic. Maybe one final question for the beer lovers out there like me. Is there somewhere where we can find your beer? I mean, maybe this will be more interesting for the American listeners out there, but it's definitely something that caught my eye.
Yeah, well, that's a very pertinent question. It's right now, this is very niche, very exclusive. It's for the moment, it's available only in Whole Foods and only on the West Coast of the U.S., California, Oregon, Washington. We hope and we expect from what Patagonia Provisions, that's the company that is producing this stuff, that it will at least be expanding into Whole Foods nationally in the U.S. in the coming couple of years. But you need to either visit the West Coast of the U.S. or know somebody who lives there and is willing to ship a case of beer to you for the moment, but it's worth the effort to get it. It's a very tasty and unique product.
That's great. I guess we'll all be we'll have to do the pilgrimage then and head on over in September.
Outstanding.
Thanks so much, Fred. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to be on.
If you like this episode and you're interested in learning more about perennial crops, about ecological intensification, or any of the other specific crops that the Land Institute and their partners are developing over in Kansas or around the world, be sure to check out their website that Fred mentioned, as well as all the other links in the description below. Of course, if you like this episode and the For Food's Sake podcast, be sure to subscribe via iTunes, to rate and review, to share it with friends and family that might be interested in hearing more episodes. And of course, you can support the podcast by liking us on Facebook, by following us on Twitter, or by following us on Instagram. As always, thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you soon.